All right, I got a haircut for the chapter on ethics because I'm a clean-cut ethicist man. All right, let's talk about the ethics chapter, chapter 4 of Entanglements, a System of Philosophy. I am particularly proud of this chapter. I guess a lot of the material in this book was developed over many years as I worked on other projects. This was more written, for this book in the sense the ideas were developed more recently, I guess you'd say. And I hope it gives quite a kind of rich consideration of the nature of the human self. That sounds pretty ambitious, but that's really what I'm aiming at, as well as to clarify, some basic ethical concepts. Now, I could say what I most directly oppose in the chapter is what I would say is the overweening rationalism of the Western tradition in ethics. The role of reason in constructing the ethical subject, we might say, the ethical agent. In Plato, somewhat different flavor in Aristotle, famously in Kant, ethics within the bounds of reason alone, and quite in revival, I would say, the emphasis on reason's rationality and the rational human subject as the center of ethics, or the only possible ethical subject. In figures such as Korsgaard, who I discussed, Parfit, and many others, as well as in the discussion, the emphasis on rational subjecthood, a rational agency as it bears on the free will problem in the contemporary discussion. I discuss in particular John Martin Fischer, who very much has that point of view, and Michael McKenna, my old friend from grad school, who also kind of clued me in on some of the current lingo and literature on the free will problem. So let me say the kind of view I'm going to be rejecting in a quotation from Christine Korsgaard. As many of these figures, characteristically, these ethicists that I'm calling rationalists, this is not, Cartesian rationalism, start with a distinction of human beings from persons, moral persons, from animals. It's amazing how thoroughly soaked the Western tradition is in that question. How centrally our ethics is constructed by our supposed contrast with animals. Right? It's almost like it's a self-defense thing. It's like the whole tradition is chanting for generations, we are not animals, we are not animals. And so when I hear this again, coming out of Parfit, right at the beginning, or Korsgaard, or John Martin Fischer, etc., I think to myself, okay, yeah, it's disembodied spirits again, defending their status from our rational free subjects, okay, in the order of nature, from the looming threat that they are animals. That's really right. Anyway, okay, this is what Korsgaard says in her book Self-Constitution. Both human beings and other animals act, but human actions can be morally right or wrong, while the actions of the other animals cannot. This must be because of something distinctive about the nature of human action, about the way in which we make choices. The name I give to this distinctive feature is the traditional one, rationality. As I understand it, reason is a power we have in virtue of a certain type of self-consciousness, consciousness of the ground of our beliefs and actions. This form of self-consciousness gives us a capacity to control our beliefs and actions that other animals lack, and makes us active in a way they are not. Just how John Martin Fischer begins to characterize freedom, human free will. What it is about us that makes it possible for us to be free. Makes us active in a way they are not. To put it another way, this form of self-consciousness makes it necessary to take control of our beliefs and actions, but we must then work out how to do that. We must find normative principles, laws, to govern what we believe and do. The distinctive feature of human beings, reason, is therefore the capacity for normative self-government. Man, that has not changed. That vision of what a human being is has not changed since Plato. It's remarkable, really. And I don't believe that anyone can believe about themselves that that's the sort of thing they are. All right. I don't know how y'all make decisions. I don't know how Christine Korsgaard makes decisions. But it's not through the sheer exercise of rationality. I'll also say this, that this vision of human freedom, human free will, and human goodness, this Kantian vision in which to be a good person is to be the lawgiver of oneself, first of all, presupposes some pretty intense forms of self-division. What is it that is giving the law to what when I give the law to myself, or insist in a process of rational deliberation that I obey the results of that deliberation? So I'd say, like, you have a division of the self into the hegemonic and the subaltern portions. And I would just say this, that first of all, the self, even in that situation, even if that were true, even if that were a true vision of the self, cannot be effortlessly identified with the rational subject in that exchange. That's not only self-liberation or self-control, it's also self-subordination. Right? There's the bit that is empowered and the bit that is enslaved in that exchange. When I control myself in a way that an animal cannot. Right? I think at a minimum we have to start talking about human subjects as both of those things. And actually, I think the exchange of power within a human subject and the state of a human subject, the arrangement of portions of a human subject, is a lot more complex and interesting than that. Right? I try to elucidate that with the case of addiction, which I try to tell from the inside in a way that addiction has often been used as an example within philosophy as a puzzle about free will. But I try to tell it from inside as in the form of exchange of power between portions of the self. Right? But my point is that Korsgaard's or John Martin Fischer's vision of the human self is a political vision, and it is authoritarian. To be free, right? One thing, if you are the lawgiver of yourself, you often may experience yourself as constrained. The phenomenology of freedom as often involves the transgression of principles, moral, legal, self-imposed, externally imposed, as it does the holding oneself to laws. In fact, this idea of holding oneself to laws as human freedom has the allure of paradox, but it also has the logical nonsense of paradox. It's a mere contradiction. Now, I argue, and I think it's quite an original series of arguments, you may not find them plausible, that free will in any form, of any sort, is not required for moral responsibility. And I'd just like to maybe read you a few examples that start to, some counterexamples that also elucidate the argument slightly, because it's quite an elaborate argument, and I think it's really worth grappling with. The position is referred to by Fischer, John Martin Fischer, as semi-compatibilism. I hold that, at least in certain circumstances, I can be responsible even if I am in no way free. Right. One interesting example of this is the way 12-step programs treat addiction. All right. Now, 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous is responsible for the disease model of addiction. They hold basically that you cannot do otherwise if you're an addict. You're unfree, and because you're ill. Right? And they also hold that you must make amends, take responsibility for, and make amends for actions you performed in the thrall of the addiction. That is, they hold both that you're not free and that you are responsible. And I think that's quite typical. We often do that, right, in many ways. And so I think we just have to detach, finally, the concept of freedom from moral responsibility. I just give some examples from ordinary language where we take up reactive attitudes, to use Strawson's term, and manifest moral attitudes, including attributions of responsibility, in cases where the thing that we're holding responsible is in no sense free, or is not plausibly thought to be free. So, for example, we sometimes hold inanimate objects responsible for things. I often blame information processing devices and hold them responsible for delaying, distracting, or disabling me. In fact, I slammed the silverware drawer just this morning because it's off its track or whatever, like stupid thing. Attribution of responsibility to events, policies, institutions, abstract objects, groups, and so on. All right, so maybe the tax cuts were responsible for the debt crisis. Well, did the tax cuts act freely? Okay, so we could probably spin a rigmarole where that makes sense in a certain way. What I'm saying is that there are many attributions of responsibility in everyday life that do not require free will. Okay, there's a number of other examples, including attributions of responsibility for good actions to people who are naturally good. That's a debate within the literature. I think people who are naturally good are just as praiseworthy as those who do right for other reasons. Let me say that my model of human freedom that I really try to develop, and it's kind of also a metaphysical model of the universe, is that freedom comes at a moment where you're acting, or it's possible that it emerges in situations in which you are both necessitated and acting spontaneously. And those two things are compatible with one another. And I use a bunch of Eastern or Asian philosophy to describe that relation. Wu Wei in Taoism, acting spontaneously, and yet in a way, but through an unfolding of internal necessity. And I quote a number of thinkers, especially Nietzsche, holding that the universe as a whole is both spontaneous and perfectly improvised, like a Louis Armstrong trumpet solo. When Louis Armstrong plays a cornet solo, say the solo in West End Blues, right? A thunderbolt when you first heard it. He's not deliberating about what the next note is. The next note is simply emerging. Now, it's emerging in a context of deliberative action in which he understands the song structure that he's in which he's mastered the vocabulary of jazz. But the improvisation emerges each time it does emerge, and it emerges differently each time, both spontaneously and of necessity. The first time you heard it, you couldn't tell what could possibly happen next. The third time you heard it, it had to be what it was. And the whole universe as a whole perhaps has no causal explanation, emerges as a spontaneous upwelling in the nothingness, or whatever, however we can say that. Right? And perhaps we emerge as a spontaneous improvisation within it. Okay, we need to really enrich our sense of freedom, both socially, in terms of transgression, law, and so on, but also our sense of what it is to be free creatures, connected to a real universe and not separate from it, deliberating about it, manipulating objects within it, but participating in it, in its spontaneous upwelling ourselves, like Louis improvised in that solo. Okay, later on.